Although there was funding for some marginalised groups across Australia in the budget last night, that did not include additional funding for Closing the Gap. As you may know, 4 of the 7 Closing the Gap targets have already been missed, and without additional funding, the rest could meet the same fate. Joining me now, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services, Linda Burney. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Leon.
Thanks very much for joining us today. First of all, obviously it would be disappointing to see no additional funding towards Closing the Gap. There were some measures targeting Indigenous Australians, but was it not enough?
There were some measures targeting Indigenous Australians, that is true, but most of it is not new money. It's money that's going to be taken out of a fund called the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which is an existing bucket of money. And in terms of specific measures that's new money, they are very, very difficult to see. I think one of the things that the government is saying to get themselves through this period is that the Prime Minister, Leon, is due to deliver his Closing the Gap report in August this year, and that what's been announced in the budget, be it rebadged money, is a down payment towards Closing the Gap. Now, I don't really know what that means, but certainly there was very little funding, almost no funding actually, for Closing the Gap.
Yeah. So what happens if these targets are not met? Because, so far it's not exactly been terribly successful, has it?
It has not been successful, but just to remind people, so Closing the Gap was a 10-year commitment that was announced by Kevin Rudd when he made the apology to the stolen generations way back then. Like you said, Leon, only 3 of the old Closing the Gap targets were being met. There has been new Closing the Gap targets announced, and what will happen if they're not met is that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people will continue to live with the shocking social justice outcomes that we're all familiar with.
Yeah. And of course, here in the ACT, where we would like to think that most of us are relatively enlightened and are more conscious of such issues, we've actually got quite a shocking record locally with Indigenous incarceration rates going up through the roof, and particularly with young Indigenous people. What's going wrong here?
Look, the ACT as a community, I think, is very forward-thinking. That is true. However, you are correct that the incarceration rates in the ACT are not much different to the incarceration rates in many other places, and particularly with young people. There's lots of things. It's about people having employment, people having reasonable housing conditions, people getting a good educational outcome. And just because you live in the ACT, there's this false theory that everyone in the ACT is employed and middle class, and that's not the truth. There's an ugly underside to the ACT, and homelessness amongst the broader population is one of the really big issues.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the federal government has been spruiking last night's budget as a budget for women. Have they managed to meet that aim?
Well, the issue really is this, that they've thrown a lot of money at women, that's true. And they have done it after 8 years of doing absolutely nothing. And I suspect, Leon, and call me a cynic if you wish, that if it had not been for the debate that we've had internationally about women and sexual violence and abuse and so forth, that the government would probably be doing almost nothing. And that's the truth of it. The other thing is this, is that if you live in Nowra or Wollongong or Newcastle or Lismore or Dubbo or a whole range of other similar places in Australia, and you want to escape violence, there is no available rental accommodation to go to. So unless there is a major investment in housing specifically targeted towards women escaping domestic violence, then you're going to miss the mark. And there was no announcement last night about additional housing.
Linda, thanks very much for chatting today.
Thank you, Leon.